This originated with some discussions regarding the impact fee study that was being revised and updated by the school board. And in order to have a better understanding of the challenges that our school district is facing, and especially in light of the fact that we consider ourselves to be partners with our school board and with the school district on many endeavors. Economic development obviously is the big overarching theme that kind of links us together, but our overall quality of life in Lake County, and we recognize the importance of what you all do, and we appreciate what you do. But oftentimes we have the opportunity to interact with our legislators, and understanding and knowing what you all are dealing with from the budgetary side is really important to us, being able to address the needs of our county, as well as take on issues such as the impact fee analysis and decide what we need to do in that regard. So we welcome you today, and we look forward to learning more about your budget and your challenges.
Madam Chair, thank you so much for the opportunity to come here this morning. I appreciate your time and the fellow commissioners' times and staff too. This morning we're going to go over some funding, Florida education funding, how it impacts our school district and our county as a whole. And again, as you said earlier, we're going to talk a little bit about the community impact that our schools have. So we're going to talk about the funding structure of school boards and state spending on education, operating funds for K-12 schools, capital outlay, the Florida lottery, Lake County's schools impact to our community, and at the end we'll have a short, brief period of questions and comments from the board. So let's get started with the funding structure for school boards. There's some differences between the way that we're funded and the way that you guys are funded. And just to back up just real quick, I was assistant superintendent in Allocation County for several years, and I had an opportunity to serve in my hometown, Lake City, Florida, Columbia County, as assistant county manager. One of the things that I found in the role as assistant county manager is that there's a lot of differences between the way that your budget's structured and the way that our budget's structured. And so when I had the opportunity to speak with our county commissioners, I tried to educate them as much as I could on the differences. There are some major differences in the way that we're funded. And so it's important to know those differences. So today I wanted to make sure I took the opportunity to handle that. 92% of our operating funds comes from the Florida Education Funding Program or other state allocations. Although we are a tax authority where we can levy ad valorem taxes, it's all done based on a formula. So a lot of times impacts that have things that have an impact on your ad valorem taxes will not have an impact on ours. So I thought that that's a real big distinction that we should cover. The FFE FP funds are made up of both state revenues and local ad valorem taxes. We have a limited ad valorem taxing authority. We know that all taxing authorities are limited 10 mils for ad valorem taxes, and we are limited by the same limit, but we have some additional limits too. By statute, we are required to levy the required local effort ad valorem millage set by the Florida legislative each year. So our major millage that we levy for operation of schools is set by the state, and we do not have an opportunity to either increase or decrease that without losing our ability to participate in the state funding at all. We are also allowed to levy a discretionary operating millage of 0.748 mils and a capital outlay millage up to 1.5 mils. And then any additional millage that we want to levy, we have to do that through voter referendums. We can levy additional ad valorem up to 10 mils. We can also levy or enforce a half-cent sales surge tax for capital needs. Again, that requires a referendum. The school board does not have any authority to levy any other taxes. So we don't have the ability to levy any kind of additional sales tax or communications tax, bed tax, or any of the other taxes that counties typically have the ability to levy. This is really important to understand. An increase in taxable value does not equate to increases in revenue. Each year, the legislator determines the amount of education funding and the required local effort from each school district. The difference between the determined amount of education funding and the required local effort is made up with state funds. Increases to the district's school taxable value are offset by reductions to state revenues for the required local effort and discretionary millages. However, increases to the district school taxable value do increase revenues for the 0.75 voter-approved millage and the 1.5 capital outlay millage. So a lot of times we think it's a good thing that we bring in a lot of property values into our county, and it'll increase, obviously it increases the county revenues, municipality revenues, and it does have somewhat of an impact on the schools, but it's not a true increase to revenues because the majority of our revenues are in that formula. So increases in taxes or taxable values at the local level results in a decrease in state funding. So it doesn't benefit the district as a whole. Other differences, one of the main differences, we do have a state oversight agency. State Board of Education is primarily the oversight and rulemaking authority over the school districts. We have a Commissioner of Education. We also have the Department of Education that provides administrative and supervisory agency under State Board of Education. So we have an oversight agency that actually oversees the majority of our operations at the county level. We're audited once every 3 years by the Auditor General's Office. The Auditor General's Office used to do the counties several years ago, and they stopped. They pulled back and let them do private auditors. But they still come to the school districts. They still review us once every 3 years. And there are several pieces of legislation and statutes that they look at every year, even though they're only there once every 3 years. So they will actually go back and look at 3 years worth of data to make sure that we're following the statutes. And then the other big difference that I had to remind a lot of people is, in county government, you hear a lot of times that our expenditures must serve a public purpose. Well, it's even more restricted to the school board. It must serve a public education purpose. So there's a lot of things that county can do with their expenditures that school boards cannot. But if it's not related to education, we're not legally allowed to do it. So let's look at state spending on education. State spending on education is set up by the Florida Constitution. Article 9 of the Florida Constitution states, the education of children is a fundamental value of the people of the state of Florida. It's therefore a paramount duty of the state to make adequate provision for education for all children residing within its borders. Adequate provision shall be made by law for a uniform, efficient, safe, secure, and high-quality system of free public education. So that sets up the background for the FFE formula that's used to fund all of the counties in the state. So let's look at state spending by category since 2003 versus 2018. This will kind of tell a story as what's been happening to funding education for the last 18 years. You can see in the first slide, on the first graph, you'll see that 2003, that about a third of education, a third of the state spending was on education. This was all education. This is not just K-12. This includes the universities, community colleges, the K-12 system, and the pre-K system altogether. So about a third of it was spent at the state level in 2003, and about a third on human services, and then the other services that are general governmental, criminal justice, natural resources, transportation, and state courts. 2018, you can see what's happened in the trend in funding in education. You can see that education is now about a quarter, a little bit more than a quarter of the state spending, and you can see that human services is taking up almost 45%, getting close to half of what the state is spending their funding on. So, the Constitution says it's the paramount duty or the primary duty of the state to fund education, but you can see trend-wise it's showing that the human services part has been taking up a lot of the expenditures for the state, and education is actually going down. So this graph here just shows the 18 years, and you can see that although the state expenditures have been increasing, the blue lines at the bottom represent education, and you can see that it's fairly flat. The red line shows that at the beginning of 2003, the state spent about 33% of its funding on education, and in 2018, it's down to about 28%. So let's speak a little bit about operating funding for K-12 schools, and this is primarily our school districts within our county. As we said earlier, we're basically funded through the Florida Education Funding Program, or the FFE program. The top line you'll see is the base funding, which is $200 million, and it is unrestricted. This is where they take the number of students and their weights. So different students have different weights depending on what kind of program they're in within the county. And they multiply it by the base student allocation, and we'll talk about the base student allocation in a few minutes. And then they have a district cost differential. So they look at the cost of providing these services in our county versus other counties, and they adjust that formula up and down. And then the next line that you have that's new this year is the best and brightest. It's $4.2 million. That was funded as a grant in previous years. The funding was there. They did add a little bit of the funding to it this year, but what they did this year was they rolled it up into the FFE formula, so now it's actually part of the regular formula education dollars. And then there's the $6.4 million of mill the 0.748 mill compression. That is also unrestricted. And we talk about the terms unrestricted and restricted, and I'm going to paint a picture here in just a minute about all of the restricted funds. But you'll see Safe Schools, ESE Guaranteed, Supplemental Academic, all of the other line items that you see in the basic FFE formula, you'll see that they're either passed through directly to teachers or principals or to the schools, or they're restricted for a specific program, such as Safe Schools, transportation, and the others. And then down at the bottom, you'll see the negative $3.5 million. That's McKay scholarships. That's funding that is pulled out from the district and handed to the private schools. And when they pull that money out, it is in the unrestricted portion. So if you look in 2003, the blue area is the base student allocation, and then the orange is the regular FEFP, and then they have some categoricals of funding, which was mainly the Florida Lottery funding. And you can see in 2003, about 75% of our funds was in that base student allocation. Now, the important part about that base student allocation is it's unrestricted, and that is the pot of money that we can use to cover general increases in our operations. So increases in insurance, increases in electricity, pay raises for our teachers, all come out of that BSA. All of those other items that are restricted for specific purposes, and they cannot be used for things such as pay raises and the other general cost increases. So you'll see in 2020, you can see that our unrestricted portion, or our base student allocation, although it has grown percentage-wise, it is shrinking, and it's more like about 66% now versus 75%. And that has been one of the impacts that we've seen in our district. This is the base student allocation. This is the amount of funding per student, and you can see from 2003 it was a little over $3,500, and in 2020 it's about $4,200. If you superimpose the line over that to show a general trend over the last several years, you can see that's a 1.11% increase. A 1.11% increase in our general dollars that were used to fund most of our increases in our operation of our school. And you can start to see why it's very hard for us to give pay raises to teachers on a consistent basis that are substantial and keep up with the cost of living, because we're only getting funded at an increase of 1.11%. So this is the headline this year. It says Florida legislation finishes K-12 budget with a 248 increase per student. That actually was a misprint. I think they had an earlier version of the conference report. It was $243 was the actual increase per student. It says the highlight of the budget, 2019 budget, is the $75 per student increase in flexible district spending. Last year, that increase was by 47 cents. So this upcoming year, they actually did give us an increase in our BSA. It's not much more than that 1.11%. It's about 1.18%. But that was the Tampa Bay headline on April 30th, 2019. But what's the reality for our district? Well, because of the FEFP formula, and because that formula has variations in how it calculates the pieces of it, that's not always a $243 increase. And I like to bring this visual out and show it to people. This is actually the FEFP formula. It's not important that you see what the numbers are. It's just the size of the FEFP formula, and you can see it's pretty comprehensive. It covers several things. But one of the things that the FEFP formula does is it creates differences between counties. So what happened this last year? What are our highlights? We did receive the $75 increase per base student allocation. And of that $243 number that they used, 97 of that increase was the best and brightest. That was actually funded in the previous year, but it was outside the FFP formula. So they moved it into the FFP formula, and they called it an increase to education funding. So it's not really a true increase to the education funding. It's just shifting it from one area to the other. Lake County schools per student funding for this current upcoming year only increased $202.52. Lake County is now ranked 62 out of 67 in per student funding. So we're very close to the bottom in funding for the state of Florida when you look at our county compared to other counties. That $41 difference of what they're advertising and what we actually got, the $41 difference per student funding, would be an additional $1.98 million that we could have received in our district. Some of the other changes, and we talked a little bit briefly about the best and brightest, but along the way, I think it's very important to understand the long-term trends that's happened in education funding and some of the things that have changed that really changed the picture of funding. We mentioned the best and brightest, which was $284 million in the current year, which was actually funded in a formula outside of the FFP formula in the prior year. Same thing happened in 2010. They shifted transportation funding, instructional materials funding, and teacher lead program. These were all grant-style programs that were outside of the education formula. They got moved into the formula, and along with that movement, the state of Florida said, we've increased education funding, when reality was they were just shifting it from one area to the other. And this is one of my favorites. I know that earlier or later in your agenda, you're going to be talking about some of your budget, and it's a rule for most municipalities and counties that they can only budget 95% of their ad valorem taxations that they expect to receive in the current year. They do that because, one, not everybody pays their taxes on time. Two, some pay it early and there's a discount involved. So the state statute always read 95%. Well, in 2011, the legislators gave us an increase in funding that really wasn't an increase in funding. All they did was they allowed us to start budgeting 96%. And it didn't give us any more money. It just gave us a little bit more budget for revenues. And they claimed that that was an increase in education funding. Today time, if you took that 1% difference in that budget for ad valorem taxes for across the state of Florida, that's $97.9 million in additional state budget for K-12 education. That wasn't real. It was just a shift in how you did the formula. And for our school district, it's a little over $1 million. So we've talked about the K-12 operating funding and what's been going on. Let's talk briefly about the capital outlay funding for K-12. Our capital outlay funding is very similar to y'all's. It's just we're primarily buying different assets. You guys are building roads and bridges and sidewalks and community centers. We're primarily on schools. That's our main function. School buses and schools is pretty much all we do with capital outlay. So just like yours, our capital outlay funding is for investment in long-term assets such as land, building, and vehicles. Capital outlay funds can be used for initial purchase and major renovations of long-term assets. They cannot be expended on day-to-day operations of assets. I like to use this when I talk to the public. The operation expenses, when you drive your car up to the gas station, you pump gas into it, that's the operation. The capital outlay is when you buy the car. So you have to look at it. They're more of a long-term investment. Local capital outlay millage proceeds can be used to construct or purchase new facilities, major renovations, repair renovations, remodel existing facilities, purchase of vehicles including buses, furnitures, and fixtures and equipment. So we got a little bit more flexibility on the local funding. For capital outlay, we can do more than just buildings. All state capital outlay funds must be expended on building new educational facilities, debt service for those facilities, or major renovation projects. And here's the key thing down at the bottom. This is one of the things that goes back to where I talked about the Auditor General earlier. This is one of the primary things that they look at. They're required by statute that they have to look at this. Any misuse of capital funds for operating purposes will result in a dollar-for-dollar reduction in the district's FEFP. So if we use our capital outlay funds for anything that it's not appropriated for in statute, then we have to pay that back. They'll actually reduce our FEFP funding at the state level the following year. So it's very important that we follow the guidelines for capital outlay funding. I'm going to talk briefly about these programs. There's three major programs from state capital outlays that the state provides for funding facilities in education. There's capital outlay and debt service, or CONDS, which is funded by motor vehicle licenses and registration taxes. The district can elect to participate in the state's bonding program. They would take the proceeds, because the proceeds are not that significant. We would never have enough in a year to do any kind of major renovation project for one of our buildings. But what we can do, or what they used to do, is the state would actually bond the next 20 years of those projected taxes, and then we could participate in that bonding, and we would get a level of funding that was significant that we do a major program with that, or a major project with that. But the thing that's important here is the state hasn't done any new bonding for any new program since 2010. So this funding is not sufficient enough to do any kind of major renovation. What it's doing now is it's paying old debt service from the prior borrowings from years ago, and then whatever's left, we're rolling into other projects to augment whatever kind of capital outlay project we can do with that. The other major one was the PICO, the Public Education Capital Outlay. This has been primarily the major state funding for education facilities since the 1990s. It really was designed for the state universities and community colleges, but as more pressures come for the state to provide funding for education facilities, they started using PICO dollars to fund K-12. And again, it's funded by the gross receipt sales tax on utilities. They also bonded that program automatically each year, and they provided all the funding to the school districts along with the other entities. State hasn't allocated funds for any K-12 new construction since 2009. And the state bonded the annual proceeds all the way up until 2012, and then they stopped bonding those proceeds. So they're no longer bonding those proceeds, which has significantly reduced the revenues, and they also stopped funding any new K-12 construction with those funds since 2009. They were giving us two pieces. They were giving us a portion for new construction. They were also giving us an annual maintenance amount that we could use to maintain our facilities. And in 2020, the state did not allocate any of those funds for school districts. So we're not getting any state PICO dollars at all this upcoming year. The last one is the lottery programs. It's funded by the lottery proceeds. A portion of the lottery proceeds are set aside for debt service and funding of school facilities. The state bonded the annual proceeds in 2009. They bonded 100% of their capacity at that point in time. So since 2009, they haven't issued any additional lottery funding for construction in K-12 schools. So all of the money that the lottery earns now is being used for debt service. It's not being used to fund any new projects at all. So as you can see, we're not receiving any major source of funding for our capital outlay needs from the state anymore. So let's look at the local capital outlay funds. The local capital outlay millage is the 1.5%. It's used for all capital needs, includes buses and equipments. Those proceeds are capped. They used to be capped at 2 mils until 2010, and then they reduced that down to 1.5 mils. And when they did that, since that reduction, we have missed over $110 million in capital outlay funding in our school district. So you can see that's been significant impact to our local funding of our capital outlay needs. The other one is the impact fees, which must be approved by the county commission, and it must be tied to new growth, and the fee is based on the cost of the impact of new residents. And then the last one is the sales tax used for specific remodeling projects and approved in it has to be approved by the referendum. And as you know, we have the 1 penny sales tax in our county, and we share a third of that with the schools, and then the county keeps a third and shares the other third with the municipalities. So let's talk about the Florida lottery, because that's one of the big things questions that we get a lot. You know, we know years ago that Florida approved the Florida lottery, and it was supposed to augment education in Florida, and hasn't been able to do that. And a lot of times people ask, well, where are your lottery dollars and where are they going? So let's look at the state's lottery program. When I initially did this presentation, the first slide was the only slide on this, and I was going to remove it and update it with this year's. But after I put the new year's up and compared it to last year's, I thought that it was very important to leave them both there for comparison. You can see that a portion of the lottery goes to the Division of Universities and the colleges, and then the Florida Bright Futures program. And then the other half, a little bit over half, in 2018, the blue part was the K-12 operations. The orange part was the debt service on those bonds that we were just talking about for capital outlay and school facilities. And the gray area is the workforce development. Now, the interesting piece about the gray area, the workforce development, is none of those funds can be spent on K-12 operations. We receive those funds, but they're for students who have already outside of the K-12 operation, adult education and other programs like that. In 2020, this last legislative session, you can see that the legislators had chosen to move funding out of the Florida K-12 operation, and they moved it into the Florida Bright Futures. So what they did was they increased the amount of funding for Florida Bright Futures, and they did that by reducing the funds to K-12 education. So you can see, that, again, the trend in Florida funding of education is they're taking it from K-12 and they're putting it in other places. So what is the Florida K-12 lottery? What do the expenditures look like on that and the trends in that? In 2002, the citizens passed a class size amendment. Since the approval of the class size amendment, Florida has spent $40.3 billion for the operating expenses related to compliance with class size. Between 2003 and 2008, Florida issued bonds in order to appropriate $2.5 billion for class size facilities in order to address class size requirements. So the majority of the funds that go to K-12 are really earmarked to handle the class size amendment requirements that Florida passed several years ago. Some other funding trends impacting education funding, the additional requirements for school security. We talked about earlier, I showed you that the district receives $2.6 million from this FFE FP program for school safety programs. That, with the change in legislation, is primarily used to put the school resource officers in each one of our schools. This year, we're budgeting to cover all of the school resource officers and the guardians that we have in our program. It's a little over $4 million to run that program. So you can see, although they set $2.6 million aside for safe schools, it's not sufficient to cover the actual keeping up with the statute. Expansion in Common Core, high states testing requirements. Each time that they come in, they make major changes to the requirements that we're required to teach our students. It's very expensive because we have to retool our educators with the right instructional materials. We have to do a lot of training, a lot of in-service points and everything else to keep up with those changes. So there's been some major changes since my career in education, and each one of those changes have cost the state of Florida a significant amount of money. And our school districts. Expansion of private school voucher programs. They did expand some of their voucher programs in the upcoming year, so we expect to see more students move from traditional education going to the private school setting. Continued reduction in local ad valorem taxation. I'm sure you're all familiar with the rollback rate when you have that conversation about your millages and how they roll back the rates, and you always have to advertise an increase even if you hold the same rate, because the rollback rate actually went down because the property values went up. Well, the state of Florida has been setting our millage rates for us, and they've been keeping in tune with that rollback rate. And what they're doing is it's kind of modified. It's not the true rollback rate. They're just setting it so that only the new property values are paying for the increases, and the old property holders are not seeing a tax increase. So it's just kind of a modified rollback rate. And then there's increased competition with capital funding for other educational entities. Our university system's doing a really good lobbying job, and our colleges, community colleges, and they're going to Tallahassee, and they're really fighting for those capital outlay dollars. And what's happened over the last few years is the school boards have lost ground, and they've lost a lot of that PICO funding to the universities and colleges. And then the additional constraints placed on local funding initiatives. There's been a trend in the statute, the legislature in the last couple of years where they're really trying to keep us from even going to our local voters and voting taxes against themselves. So they're pushing extra requirements for sales tax initiatives, and they're also looking at impact fees. As you know, we had an audit criticism a couple of years ago with impact fees on how we were using it to pay debt service. I'm happy to tell you that the Department of Education has reviewed our expenditures, and they have agreed with our usage of that. So we've been cleared by the Florida Department of Education for our usage of those funds. And one of the things I also like to do just as a visual in this presentation is not only have they restricted our funds, they've increased our legislation. And this is the book that we use. This is the Florida school legislation, all the statutes that deal with Florida education. And you can see it's very small print, it's very thick. And what I like to tell people is there's very few mays in this book. It's full of shalls. You shall, we have to. There's so many requirements that we have to do. And the problem with that is every time they add those new requirements, if they don't add sufficient funding, then that takes up our availability to keep up with our general operating costs for the schools. So what's the community impact from Lake County schools? Well, one thing is, the major thing is we educate the majority of the workforce in the county. 92% of Lake County school-age children attend public schools. In 2018, 2,750 students graduated with a standard diploma from a traditional public school. In 2019, 932 students were dual enrolled with Lake Sumter Community College. When they're dual enrolled at that college, that means that we're taking our funding and we're paying for them to go to the community college. An additional 418 were enrolled in the Health Science Collegiate Academy that partners with Lake Sumter Community College. So we have a significant number of students that are already dual enrolled in some type of post K-12 education system. And in 2019, we had 76 students that graduated from high school, and at the same time, they graduated with an AA degree from community college. We have 30 career and technical education programs and 80 different academies across our middle schools and high schools in our district. During 2019, we had 10,989 high school students and 6,619 middle school students enrolled in some type of CTE program in our district. Our CTE programs cover business technology, agriculture, auto mechanics, construction, food service, healthcare, and other industries. And 2,840 high school students and 590 middle school students earned an industry certification during 2019. And we're happy to say those industry certifications, they do articulate into the community college level too. So not only are they earning a certificate, but they're also earning college credits for a lot of what they're doing, or something that'll equate to college credit for what they're doing. So what's the economic impact of our employees? Lake County Schools is the largest employer by the county. And we know that the county is second in the largest. We're actually about twice the size, over twice the size of the county in our number of employees. We employ 5,561 employees during the 2019 year, and this does not include any of our substitute teachers or our substitute bus drivers. This is just our full-time employees. Our salary budget for 2019 was $195.7 million. That's money that's going into our community right here. Of our employees, 55%, or 3,078, have a bachelor's degree or higher, compared to 22% for the other residents in our county. So you can see most of our employees are at a higher ratio of educated employees, obviously because teachers are required to have their teaching degree. All of our employees participate in the Florida retirement system, and all of our employees and their families have an opportunity to participate in our health insurance, very similar to what county employees have. Other community impact, $60.5 million of our funding also goes out through our accounts payable department, either to the charter schools or other Lake County agencies and businesses in our community. And what I did was I took a list of all of our businesses and how much we spend, and I narrowed it down by our zip codes in our county just to show what flows specifically to our zip code in this county from our school district. So $60.5 million is another big pot of money going into our community. We also provide the emergency shelters and food distribution for emergency management for the county. We also provide performing and visual art events, recreational sport activities in the community. We provide facility usage by community groups and churches and others. We allow them to use our facilities, usually at a very reduced rate. And of course, always families consider local schools as one of the top determining factors when they relocate to a community. So all these things we feel like has a good positive impact in our community and economic development. So I've sped through that real fast. I'm sorry, I apologize for that, but I wanted to be respectful of your time. So if there are any comments or questions or anything that you'd like to have, I'd be happy to respond.
Questions? That was quite a presentation. I mean, that gave us a really good kind of comprehensive look at what the district is up against. Sadly, it's kind of bleak. You know, it's trending in not the right direction.
Thank you. I agree. That was an excellent presentation, and I appreciate it. My question is, I know that there are concerns about the state formula, and is it kind of two-part? Is it the mid-sized counties that are kind of clustered with a negative impact? And do you think there's any hope or movement to take a look at the funding allocation to make it more fair?
Yes, ma'am. In a nutshell, to try to sum up, most of those formulas that are used as parts of the FFE formula, they have a base amount for all school districts. So your smaller school districts get additional funding because the base amount's higher than what we get as a percentage-wise. And then your larger school districts that have higher land values, we are what they called compressed on our millages. So they bring the state makes up additional dollars for our millage to get us to the state average. But all of those counties that are below the state average are similar to us. They get funded the same. Those counties that have higher land values that are above the average actually receive additional funding that we do not get. So your larger school districts that have a lot higher land value per student, they get additional funding that we don't get. So we're kind of that middle ground. We're Central Florida. We don't have a lot of coastline. We don't have a lot of land value, high land values. We have some industry, but not real high industry levels. So that leads to lower land values which means we're only brought up to the average. So with all of those base funding amounts being higher for those formulas for the smaller school districts, that just kind of leaves us in the middle, which means we're less funded than most school districts.
Okay, but how about, are you going to, is the school system looking for support, again, this next legislative session for reviewing the formula, or do you think that's?
Yes, ma'am. There's two pieces that people look at. One is the compression, which we did get additional compression dollars this last year, but it only brings you up part of the way. It doesn't make you whole. So we'll continue to fight for that. They appropriate that each year. They have not put that permanently into the formula. So every year we have to ask for that compression, and it's not sufficient to make up the differences. The other one is the DCD, which is the district cost differential. You'll hear a lot of school districts complain about the district cost differential. And there's some school districts that have high cost and high land values, but their DCD number is low. So they've asked the legislators to go back and look at that, and they're going to do some kind of study in the upcoming year to see how they can manipulate that DCD to kind of make it fair for other school districts. But yes, ma'am, we're going to continue to ask our legislators to keep looking at that.
And to the school board members and school superintendent, if you need our support, I hope you'll let us know for any legislative efforts, so.
Yeah, we would appreciate that, to receive maybe your, sort of your talking points, your white papers or analysis, the things that you're providing as you make that case. If you could get that over to us as well, so that hopefully we can try to incorporate that into our legislative priorities as well. Try to do our part to help out. I guess that brings us to this question about the school impact fee study, and I'm not sure, it's not on our agenda today. We're not there yet, okay, but we all have a copy of it, so we have an opportunity to review it, and it did indicate that there was some reduction in the recommended rate, so that is certainly helpful, because we get a lot of feedback, obviously, from the business community and the construction community about the impact, and I mean, as a whole, on the affordability of housing in Lake County. So it certainly hits us kind of hard in that regard. In fact, a lot of our programs that we do for waivers or, where we try to give relief, we have an apartment complex, I believe, that we're looking at today, that the assistance that we're giving is actually making up for impact fee charges that put the cost of that out of reach. So, but it is good to see that that's showing a reduction as we take that up in the future. And we also, I think, have an ask coming to you all for the impact fee waiver program that we've worked on with you in the past. And I think that we've gotten that information over to the school district, and we were able to put something in place as well for transportation impact fees for similar situations of infill lots, trying to help our local builders and people that have those existing lots that are not in new subdivisions be able to build at a more affordable rate. So we appreciate the partnership we shared with that, and we hope to have your support as well. Commissioner Sullivan?
Just a short comment, and this is the kind of information the public needs to know, because sometimes you're doing great things in the Lake County school system, and sometimes that word doesn't get out, because it's the old adage, people will tell 7 people they had a bad experience, but they'll only tell 2 people they had a good experience, and you're caught up in that. And having been a school board member, when you throw that first number up there, that 92% of your funding you don't even control, and to the point in the school system that everything is categorized. There's a category for everything, and so. And sometimes they don't make distinction between what Lake County needs and what Orange County needs. Here's your pot of money, but you still got to use it on this building or this avenue. And it is really, probably, having been an elected official for many, many years, is the most frustrating job I ever had, to be honest, as an elected official. But keep doing what you're doing. And you're a great partner to us. I mean, people don't know during the recent hurricane that we're finally getting hopefully getting some reimbursement on. Without the Lake County school system to provide the shelters, we'd have had a large part of our population vulnerable to the ravages of the hurricane that came through. So we appreciate what you do in coordination with us, and down to the level of sitting in the EOC with us on hours on end to make that happen. So we appreciate what you do, and keep it up. And that coming from a grandfather who has a child in the public school system. So.
Madam Chair, if you don't mind, I'd like to just speak to what he just said. One of the things we get asked a lot of times by the public is, why is it so expensive to build a school? And we have to follow the state, what they call the SREF, the requirements for education facilities. And a lot of those requirements in that facility are building shelters for the community. And so, there's a lot of talk about it as 15 to 20% of the cost of building a school, so that our schools can be used as emergency management shelters for the county. So just
Makes
wanted
a
to add that.
difference, definitely.
Yeah, and the cost of building materials is not going to get cheaper anytime soon, so that's going to go up probably 20%. I just wanted to just a quick opportunity to thank you very much, Mr. Ward, for the presentation, and Superintendent, great job, and a couple of school board members. I know Sandy, we talk sometimes. I know Bill and I, we talk a lot, and Mark Dodd, school board member Mark Dodd, we talk. So I appreciate that dialogue that we have. Coming from a parent that has 3 kids in 3 different public schools in Lake County, I appreciate the challenges that you face, and look forward to discussion on how we can work together to keep the funding at its optimal level, whatever we can do together. I think particularly the discussion this coming year on maybe some legislation that could pass on not allowing us to not have to use general fund or some replacement fund to waive impact fees. So we'll kind of have that. I hope we'll have that discussion and see how that affects us, because obviously, just thinking out loud in this, if you do that, that might be good at helping us with, say, affordable housing. But if we do that too much, then it obviously affects you, because then you're not able to fund schools, and the money has to come from somewhere, and we know that you need it. So I look forward to that discussion, is what I'm trying to say. And the door is always open. Please feel free, school board members, to reach out to me, and I know you do to other commissioners as well. So thank you.
Any other comments? The stats and the results of the CTE program are really, really impressive. And that's one of those things that I really like to talk to people about, try to learn as much as I can about what you're doing with CTE, just because a lot of people don't know that those programs are out there. And I think one of the most fascinating things I learned recently was that the construction academy that you have at Leesburg High School is now going to be duplicated at Eustis. And that is just fabulous. And it's kind of like we've come full circle. People will ask, why don't we have SHOP anymore? Well, we're getting back into some of those basics, as well as some of the more advanced certifications, obviously, with the the technical skills and computer skills and media, and of course the culinary program is really, really awesome. So we appreciate that, and this has been a great opportunity for us to learn more about you all, and thank you for doing this.
And I have one other question, maybe for Jeff. Do we have a date when the impact fees will be coming back to us yet?
No, ma'am, but I would expect at probably one of your meetings in August.
Okay, and then one thing that we did note, if the fees are going down, that we don't have that same wait period from the time that we advertise our ordinance and adopt our ordinance. It can go into effect immediately. So everybody, just to keep that in mind, because usually we have a wait period because the fees are going up. So it's a good problem to have. So,
Thank you again for the opportunity.
okay, great.